I have no reason to dwell in this very special memoir on the pre-funeral formalities which had to be attended to, or on the funeral itself, which was as quiet as the marriage had been. But a few incidents pertaining to those 4 or 5 days after Charlotte's simple death have to be noted. My first night of widowhood I was so drunk that I slept as soundly as the child who had slept in that bed. Next morning I hastened to inspect the fragments of letters in my pocket. They had got too thoroughly mixed up to be sorted into 3 complete sets. I assumed that, "And you had better find it because I cannot buy," came from a letter to Lowe, and other fragments seemed to point to Charlotte's intention of fleeing with Lowe to Parkington or even back to Piskey, lest the vulture snatch her precious lamb. Other tatters and shreds, never had I thought I had such strong talons, obviously referred to an application not to St. A, but to another boarding school which was said to be so harsh and grey and gaunt in its methods, although supplying croquet under the elms, as to have earned the nickname of Reformatory for Young Ladies. Finally, the 3rd epistle was obviously addressed to me. I made out such items as, "After a year of separation we may," "Oh my dearest, oh my," "Worse than if it had been a woman you kept," or "Maybe I shall die," but on the whole my gleanings made little sense. The various fragments of those 3 hasty missives were as jumbled in the palms of my hands as their elements had been in poor Charlotte's head. That day John had to see a customer, and Jean had to feed her dogs, so I was to be deprived temporarily of my friend's company. The dear people were afraid I might commit suicide if left alone, and since no other friends were available, Miss Opposite was incommunicado, the McCoos were busy building a new house miles away, and the Chatfields had been recently called to Maine by some family trouble of their own, Leslie and Louise were commissioned to keep me company under the pretence of helping me to sort out and pack a multitude of orphan things. In a moment of superb inspiration, I showed the kind and credulous Farlows we were waiting for Leslie to come for his paid tryst with Louise, a little photograph of Charlotte I had found among her affairs. From a boulder she smiled through blown hair. It had been taken in April 1934, a memorable spring. While on a business visit to the States, I had had occasion to spend several months in Piskey. We met, and had a mad love affair. I was married, alas, and she was engaged to Hayes. But after I returned to Europe, we corresponded through a friend, now dead. Jean whispered she had heard some rumours, and looked at the snapshot, and still looking, handed it to John, and John removed his pipe and looked at lovely and fast Charlotte Becker, and handed it back to me. Then they left for a few hours. Happy Louise was gurgling and scolding her swain in the basement. Hardly had the Farlows gone than a blue-chinned cleric called, and I tried to make the interview as brief as was consistent with neither hurting his feelings nor arousing his doubts. Yes, I would devote all my life to the child's welfare. Here, incidentally, was a little cross that Charlotte Becker had given me when we were both young. I had a female cousin, a respectable spinster in New York. There we would find a good private school for Dolly. Oh, what a crafty Humbert! For the benefit of Leslie and Louise, who might, and did, report it to John and Jean, I made a tremendously loud and beautifully enacted long-distance call and simulated a conversation with Shirley Holmes. When John and Jean returned, I completely took them in by telling them in a deliberately wild and confused mutter that Lowe had gone with an intermediate group on a 5-day hike and could not be reached. "Good Lord," said Jean, "what shall we do?" John said it was perfectly simple. He would get the Climax police to find the hikers. It would not take them an hour. In fact, he knew the country, and... "Look," he continued, "why don't I drive there right now, and you may sleep with Jean?" He did not really add that, but Jean supported his offer so passionately that it might have been implied. I broke down. I pleaded with John to let things remain as they were. I said I could not bear to have the child all around me, sobbing, clinging to me. She was so high-strung. The experience might react on her future. Psychiatrists have analysed such cases. There was a sudden pause. "Well, you are the doctor," said John a little bluntly. "But after all, I was Charlotte's friend and adviser. One would like to know what you are going to do about the child anyway." "John," cried Jean, "she is his child, not Harold Hayes's. Don't you understand? Humbert is Dolly's real father." "I see," said John. "I'm sorry. Yes, I see. I didn't realize that. It simplifies matters, of course. And whatever you feel is right." The distraught father went on to say he would go and fetch his delicate daughter immediately after the funeral, and would do his best to give her a good time in totally different surroundings, perhaps a trip to New Mexico or California. Granted, of course, he lived. So artistically did I impersonate the calm of ultimate despair, the hush before some crazy outburst, that the perfect Farlows removed me to their house. They had a good cellar, as cellars go in this country, and that was helpful, for I feared insomnia and a ghost.